Okay, I'm being told that we are live. Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Mark Sullivan. I'm a GMAT instructor with Manhattan Prep based in Seattle, Washington. A little about myself. My background is in mathematics. I was a math major in college, ended up in Seattle for the PhD program in mathematics at the University of Washington. Decided somewhere along that path I enjoyed teaching a lot more than I liked publishing papers nobody else would ever read. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been teaching GMAT for about 10 years. Up until pretty recently, I taught a lot of in-person classes here in Seattle. We are now moved entirely online, as is much of the rest of the world. I do teaching, tutoring, manage our post-exam assessment team, and do a lot of curriculum development with Manhattan Prep as well. So happy to be here with all of you today. We're going to talk about many of the changes we've all been going through with respect to the GMAT in recent weeks, and talk about how that affects your studies. So let's go ahead and dive in. One thing I want you to realize here is that the GMAT can be a very stressful experience, even under normal times. If you're feeling stressed about some of the changes recently with test center closures and whatnot, that is okay to feel stressed. You need to, first and foremost, tend to more pressing concerns first. The most important thing here is your own health and safety, the health and safety of your family. Again, I've been doing this for a little while. I will tell you that GMAT will still be here. If you have more pressing concerns to tend to, the GMAT is still going to be around. Business schools are still going to be around. Make sure that you tend to those more pressing concerns first. Second, I want you to breathe. Let's all do it right now. In through your nose, out through your nose. This is something you want to do regularly when you're taking the test. It's also something you can use to help handle stress in everyday life. Don't forget to breathe. This is a great opportunity to get into some mindfulness meditation as well. We're going to talk later about some of the specific benefits for mindfulness meditation when it comes to your GMAT preparation. But this is something that's going to be helpful in your day-to-day life as well. I was talking to a friend the other day, encouraging him to try some meditation. And his response was, who has time to meditate in a crisis? This is a very interesting kind of crisis that we're running into here. It's the kind of crisis where the solution is, to some extent, us being more isolated, us spending more time at home, us spending more time with our own minds. Getting into meditation right now is actually the perfect solution to this type of crisis. Again, we're going to talk later about specifically how this can help your GMAT studies, but I'd encourage you to do this even if you weren't studying for the GMAT right now. Something else I want you to try is listing out some things for which you are grateful. For example, I'm in Seattle, as I mentioned earlier. My kids have been out of school for about 3 weeks. They're getting a little bit stir crazy. I haven't ventured more than a couple hundred yards from my own house in about that same amount of time. We're under a bit of self-isolation here. And yet I have a lot of things to be grateful for. I'm grateful for the internet, so I can still have some connection with other human beings, and also so I can keep doing my job. I'm still able to meet regularly with my students just as I would if we were getting together in person. I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful to have this extra time with my children. Now, I'm not going to lie and say it's not a little stressful to be designing a homeschool curriculum on the fly, but I'm very happy to have, 5 or 6 hours a week I would have spent stuck in traffic if I were still meeting people in person, and have that extra time with my kids at home. So take a moment to do that. Actually think of 3 things for which you're grateful. Say them out loud, right? Really feel the gratitude for that. And finally, let's make sure we look for the positives. And yes, there are a lot of positives, both for your day-to-day life and for your GMAT studies. Obviously, I'm going to be a bit more focused on the GMAT studies aspect of that today. So what are these positives about which I am talking here? Well, y'all, let's think back 4 weeks. A lot of folks weren't even washing their hands the right way. So now we're going to do that surgical scrub, 20 seconds, lots of soap and lots of warm water, right? And we're going to use this as an opportunity to reset our GMAT studies. We're going to study for the GMAT the right way. We're going to have more time to do this the right way. And we're going to have an opportunity to reflect on how we've been studying and what kind of study we want to do going forward. Just so we get a sense of where to prioritize things. And I see a number of people are commenting now. Welcome everybody who's just joining us. Maybe you all could let me know in chat just a quick sense of where you are in your GMAT studies. Are you just getting started? Are you on the other end of the spectrum? You've been studying for a long time and you'd been hoping to take the test in April? Are you kind of around the midway point? Where are we in terms of our preparation, in terms of our study? Okay, I see some folks are midway. I see some folks were hoping to take the test soon. We'll talk through what to do about those different timelines based on your situation a little bit later. But for now, I think no matter where you are in your studies, it is not too late to have a little bit of a reset, to think through some of the most effective GMAT study tools and make sure you're getting good use of these in your preparations. So I'm going to take a minute to talk through each of these 4 different things: mastering your foundation, forming good GMAT habits, using correctly an error or review log, and mindfulness meditation for your studies. So let's start with mastering your foundations. Again, a couple of you are kind of new to the GMAT. Some of you have been studying for a while. Those of you studying for a while probably have a sense of what this graph is conveying to you. But if you didn't know already, the GMAT is what's called an adaptive test. So when you sit down to take the GMAT, you have at that moment a certain ability level for that section. Now, ability levels change over time. That's what preparation is really about. It's about taking this green horizontal line, which would represent your estimated ability, and actually pushing it up higher by mastering content, mastering strategies, perfecting your process for different things. But the way the test works is it's going to begin by feeding you a mid-level question. Not too easy, not too hard. And then it's going to adapt based on whether you're getting questions right or wrong. Generally speaking, when you get questions right, the test adapts upward and gets a little bit harder. When you get questions wrong, the test adapts downward. It gets a little bit easier. So as we're approaching this, we want to remember that in a sense, it's our easiest misses that convey the most information to the test. If you're facing a really high level question and you miss it, that gives the test almost no information about you. What makes the question really high level is the fact that almost everybody misses it. So it doesn't tell the test anything new about you. But when you miss a lower level question, that actually conveys a fair amount of information to the test. The test is going to read more into that. And I'll tell you, especially on the quant section, even the highest level test scores are still missing some questions. I've hit a perfect Quant 51 multiple times in the times that I've taken the test. And even those times that I'm trying to do my best, I'm trying to get a Quant 51, I still have a couple questions per section that I tend to bail on because I know that they're not reasonable to get done in only the 2 to 3 minutes that you have. So when we're preparing, we've got to keep this in mind. We've got to prepare in such a way that we're not making careless mistakes, that we're not missing things because we have basic content gaps. We've got to prepare in such a way that we are perfect on the lower level stuff, really, really strong at the moderate stuff, and accepting of the fact that we can miss some really high level stuff and still get a great score. So making sure that as you study, you really work on foundational material and you get to a point where you're extremely confident, extremely accurate, and working at good pace on lower level material. This is one of the most important things you can do in your studies. Let me also say, for those of you really gunning for a very high level score, thinking I need to get a few of these high level questions right, it's not as though the GMAT starts testing different stuff at very high levels. If you're doing really well, you're not going to see a multivariable calculus problem. Instead, you're going to see the same stuff you've seen at lower levels, but with additional twist, with additional concepts layered in. And so working on that foundation not only gets you to those higher trajectory levels, it also gives you the skills you're still going to be using on some of those highest level problems. So if you found yourself focusing too much on high level stuff and still making some lower level mistakes, use this as an opportunity to reset your approach and really think, how do I get to perfection on the easier stuff here? All right, so that's reset number one. Reset number 2, I want you to recognize that in many ways, this is a decision-making test. This is a test of what habits you have in place. And when we get to the test center, or when we take the test at home, more on that later, we are going to fall back on our habits. Everybody falls back on their habits when they're in stressful circumstances. And so a lot of how you're going to do on the actual test when you get around to taking it comes down to what habits you're actually establishing right now in your preparation. And I think using this as an opportunity to recognize that and really reprioritize our efforts and think this is not like preparing for a college math test I would have taken. This is not like preparing for a college English test I would have taken. This is a test where I'm going to go in and I'm going to be, in essence, a series of automatic reactions based on what I'm seeing in individual problems. And I need to be at a point where my process is habitual. What I really mean by this are these two definitions: a tendency, right, that you stick to, or an automatic reaction to a specific situation. So how do we foster these things? How do we adjust our studies to make sure that we've got this big goal in mind? Well, I think one big thing is to do some goal setting. So when you sit down to practice sets of, say, official guide problems, I don't ever want you to fall into the bad habit of simply doing problem sets for the sake of doing problem sets. I think we all realize that there are going to be some diminishing marginal returns to just doing a ton of problems. But what I find in my experience from teaching this test is that those diminishing marginal returns can actually become negative. If you're doing a ton of problems without a good level of intentionality, you can almost end up drilling in bad habits as opposed to what you're supposed to be doing, which is developing and fostering good habits. So one of the best things you can do to make sure you're intentional about this is setting an actionable or achievable goal before every problem set you do. And this does not have to be anything too sophisticated. This can be as simple as, I want to take a deep breath at the beginning of each problem. I see somebody was asking about reading comprehension. Maybe you're doing a time set of verbal problems, and you set as your goal, I want to make sure that every time I get a detailed question, I actually go back to the passage and find proof for that detailed question before I start looking at the answer choices. A goal could be as simple as, I want to use a certain organization system for every data sufficiency problem I see. This is what I mean by actionable, achievable goals. You take one little thing that you want to, by test day, just be habitual, and you make that your focal point for the time set you're about to do. This is how we develop and foster habits over time. Another really important tool for habit formation is to create what are called reaction flashcards. So again, we're trying to train automatic reactions to specific situations. This is one of the most effective kind of flashcards you can create for the GMAT. I'll tell you an example of a very ineffective flashcard, which is the type of thing I see all the time. I think it's the type of flashcard we all use back in middle school and high school, perhaps. One side might say something to the effect of the Pythagorean theorem, and the other side will say a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The problem with that kind of flashcard is you're never on the GMAT going to see, quote, the Pythagorean theorem. I suppose unless it's a reading comprehension passage about Pythagoras. But on the quant section, this is not the type of test it is. It's not a test to see if you have certain formulas memorized. Instead, it's a test of whether you can recognize something specific and know what to do about it. And that's what this kind of flashcard is about, describing when I see a specific situation, I will do this in response. So some examples of good reaction flashcards. When I see a problem-solving problem with only percentages, no fixed values, I will plug in my own number to solve the problem. Or when I see a sentence correction problem in which there's a subject followed by a lot of modifiers before I get to the verb, I will check all of the answer choices for subject-verb agreement. That's what I mean by a reaction flashcard. What's the specific scenario I want to train myself to react to or to recognize, and what's my response that I want to have on the back end of that. All right. So that's the second study reset I want you all to think about, forming good habits and really making that a priority in your studies. The next thing is making sure we're keeping and using correctly an error or review log. Let me know in chat. Is this something you're doing already? Just a quick yes or no. Are you keeping and regularly consulting or reviewing an error log? And just as I'm waiting for some responses there, I'll tell you one thing here. Over my years as a GMAT instructor, every single student I've heard from after taking a class with me or doing some tutoring sessions or even a post-exam assessment with me, every one of those students who's emailed me and said, hey, Mark, I got this 700 plus score, some great score. I've asked every single one of those students over the years 2 questions. What are the 2 or 3 things you did in your preparation and the 2 or 3 things you did on test day itself that you think contributed the most to your success? And, we're talking a couple thousand responses to these questions by this point. One thing I've learned is that people are very superstitious. I had this one student who said he got a very good practice test score while wearing his favorite pair of gym shorts. And he apparently did not wash those for a few weeks and then went and took the test wearing those same gym shorts. I don't know that I'd advise that in particular. But it's the responses that I get again and again and again that I know are the things that really work. And for that question, what did you do in your preparation? It's not even close. The clear winner, 90+% of these high-performing test takers, tell me that they kept and regularly reviewed an error log. So I see a few people are keeping an error log. Some people are not. Again, what a wonderful opportunity to rethink our studies, to start keeping an error log if you're not, and to maybe rethink how effective your error log can be if you are. So there is not a single right way to do this. But I'll tell you, I think any good error log should have at a minimum these 5 components. So you want to reference the problem, right? Is it OG 2020? What's the source? What type of problem is it? What's the number? I like to also jot down a little snippet of the text of the problem. Not the full problem, but just enough to jog my memory if I'm looking at it a few days later. Categorize the content. What was this testing? Was this testing a certain exponent rule? Was this testing inference and reading comprehension? What was the content here? In this way, over time, you can start to notice patterns. You might have certain content areas that you tend to miss at a higher rate. And maybe that's because you have a content gap in that area and there's something you need to go learn. Or maybe that's just a tendency. Sometimes people will say no, they're exponent rules, but then tend to miss exponent problems because they tend to make careless mistakes in that area. So tracking the content is very important so you can start to see if any of those patterns emerge. But the next 2, in my view, are really the most important. We want to make sure that we really clearly diagnose our mistakes. And my advice here is that you banish the words careless error from your vocabulary. The problem with that is we end up with a log that says careless error 100 times. And it's not very insightful to say careless error 100 times. You want to be hyper specific here. I'll give you an example from my own preparations for the GMAT, which were longer ago than I care to admit. But I noticed I had a certain tendency, which was anytime I had to transcribe a number that was, say, 3 or more digits from the computer screen to my paper, I have this tendency to sometimes flip 2 of the digits. The problem says 873, and I would write down 837 on my paper. And it's the classic kind of mistake. We want to just kick ourselves when we make that kind of mistake. We want to just say, oh, gosh, that was so careless. I've got to be more careful next time. But then we keep making that same mistake over and over again. And this was my experience, too. I didn't know how to change that little quirk in my mind that tended to reverse 2 digits. So I found that what I needed to do was call it out specifically. I couldn't just label that as a careless mistake and sweep it under the rug. I had to say specifically, what am I doing? I am flipping 2 digits when I write down a longer number, or sometimes dropping a digit in that longer number. And it's the diagnosis of the mistake that better sets up the appropriate takeaway. How are you going to avoid that mistake in the future? So what I think of as the takeaway, this should be an honest answer to the question, why is future me not going to make that mistake? How am I going to avoid that in its entirety going forward? And I'll tell you what I came up with for my particular mistake is every time I had to write down a number of 3 or more digits, my takeaway was when I see that, I will write it down, look back at the computer screen, look back at my paper. It takes 1/10 of a second to do it. And have I ever flipped the digits since that? Of course, I do it all the time. But I can honestly say, I don't think I have missed a single GMAT problem in the last 10 years after I got that takeaway for that reason. All right. So when I flip the digits, again, I have my takeaway. I look back at the screen, back at my paper. So when it happens, I see it right away and I can fix it right away. So this when I see blank, I will blank format is not only great for training your automatic reactions, it's also fantastic for keeping your takeaways highly actionable, right? So those are really the core of what's in a good error log. Finally, you should make a plan to redo things. This is how you get what learning scientists call spaced repetition. And I mean literally schedule it in. Make a date with that problem, right? You might say, all right, April 1st, I'm going to come back and I'm going to redo this problem. And it's not an April Fool's joke. I'm actually going to go redo it. I do get some hesitancy sometimes from my own students about redoing problems that they've seen before. They'll say, well, I remember the problem. I remember the answers. And I say a couple things with respect to that. One, when you come back and redo or revisit a problem, the purpose is never to just get to the answer, right? The point is not B or whatever the answer is. The point is for you to recognize the thing you want to recognize and to perfectly execute on your takeaways. That is how you get this spaced repetition. You're drilling in those good habits. I'll also say GMAT problems are so complex and layered and interesting, really at all levels. And I am not kidding, where sometimes I'll be teaching a problem in a class of mine for maybe the 200th time I've taught that problem. And a student will ask a question on the 201st time that'll make me go, oh, I never looked at it that way. That's really interesting. And so there's a lot of value to coming back and revisiting these things over time. You can also take some notes on how the redo went. Maybe it went great and you just need to come back to it a third time a couple weeks later. Maybe it went very poorly and you want to make sure you schedule a third and a fourth and a fifth time to come back to that problem to really get it down. But these are the basic parameters of a good error log. I see somebody, Kriti, is asking, what if you miss some problems when you redo? So fantastic. So make a note of that, Kriti, and schedule another time to come back to it. Keep cycling back to it until you've really gotten to full mastery on that problem. Great question. All right. The fourth thing I want you to encourage you to think about as you're resetting your GMAT studies, and I mentioned this earlier, as just something I would advise everybody in this day and time right now, is getting to the habit of regular mindfulness meditation. Maybe you all can let me know in chat. Do you meditate regularly right now? Is it something you've tried in the past? Do you have any sort of hesitancy over trying meditation? And as I'm waiting to see some responses there, I'll tell you with my own experience, I learned very early into my GMAT teaching career what a stressful experience this was for students. And my background prior to teaching GMAT was teaching college math classes, which is something I still do part-time. But what I found is it's just a very different ballgame. It's much more about your mindset than a traditional college math test. Right? A college math test, you know you're ready when you can basically go into the test expecting to get all the questions right. And that will never be the case on the GMAT. And so I remember early in my GMAT teaching career doing kind of a deep dive into the various research literature on test anxiety and test stress. And one thing that kept popping up again in so many of these studies was mindfulness meditation. So for years and years, I recommended to students that were dealing with a heightened level of stress on the GMAT to give this a try, right? Because I had seen in studies that it was very effective. And I'll tell you, for much of that time, I did not meditate myself. I was a bit of a hypocrite on this. A few years ago, I sort of heard an analogy that was very helpful to me in understanding the benefits of meditation. And since that time, it's been something that I do quite regularly as well. So the analogy was that of a bicep curl. So when I used to sit down to try to meditate, my initial thought would be, I can't clear my head. I keep having these distracting thoughts. My mind keeps wandering elsewhere. I just can't do it. And that was because I thought the point of meditation was to somehow sit down and have a clear mind. But that is ultimately not the point. In the same way that in doing a bicep curl, the point is not to be in this position. The whole point is the change. You're supposed to go from here to here, and that's what exercises the muscle. So in this analogy, here is the distracting thought, and here is you recentering your focus where you want it to be, which in most meditation practice, you focus on your breathing, right? So that is, in fact, the exercise. You're supposed to have distracting thoughts. Everyone's mind will. Your mind is a constant wash of little thoughts and little emotions popping up here and there. And in meditation, all you're doing is trying to sit a little bit above that, acknowledge these things non-judgmentally, and continually bring your focus back to where you want it to be in the same way that you exercise this muscle in a bicep curl. by continually moving from here to here. So to be clear, when you're in the test center, you should not be in a meditative state. You should be hair on fire, mind racing in the test center. But the idea is that through regular meditation practice, you've built up that muscle that allows you to acknowledge distracting thoughts, but then return your attention to where you want it to be, which is at all times the problem on the screen right in front of you. So I'm a big believer, whether you think you're dealing with an excess amount of stress related to the GMAT or not, studying with mindfulness is going to be more effective than simply studying alone. A few different sources you could take a look at if you wanted to give this a try and get into it. One, if you just Google guided mindfulness practice, Logan Thompson. Logan is a Manhattan Prep instructor as well. His other job is as a mindfulness coach. He wrote a really great book on this subject as well. But he's got a few free recordings that you can find. And a few apps. I personally use 10% Happier and the Waking Up app. I think they're really fantastic. There's lots of other good ones out there. Right. So you don't necessarily need to sign up for a paid service or anything. You can find a lot of free versions on the internet. So that is the fourth way in which I want you to consider resetting your GMAT studies, building this in from the start. Let's really capitalize on this opportunity of all the upheaval around the test center closures and whatnot. So what to do now? All right, let me get a sense of where folks are. Actually, I know a few of you mentioned already that you had been studying for a while and you're probably ready to go. So you all are probably in the latter category. You'd been wanting to test here in the spring. Others maybe were planning to test in the summer or the fall anyway, in June through September or sometime. Let me say, if you were originally planning to test in the summer or the fall, keep an error log and carry on. So you do not need to radically adjust your plan at this point. Now, I can't predict the future. No one can predict the future. So we don't know for sure whether test centers are going to be open at that point. They are for sure closed in the US, at least through April. And I would definitely encourage you to take a look at MBA.com. They are posting regular updates there right on their homepage, so you can get a sense of what's going on with test centers near you. But again, I don't think you need to radically change your game plan if you're kind of midway through, other than doing the reset stuff that we talked about earlier. Okay, so one of two things will happen. Either the test centers will reopen and you'll be able to go take the test as you normally would, or as the GMAC announced just a couple days ago, there is going to be an in-home version of the GMAT that is supposed to be available in mid-April. Now, they've released basically no details about this. I will tell you, the ETS, which puts out the GRE, made a similar move about a week ago, and we have a little more information there. They use a service called ProctorU, and it has some drawbacks here and there. You have to be using a Windows computer, not a Mac computer. You also have to allow the remote proctor to have access to your desktop and everything. So you'll see details on that potential experience for the GMAT side posted on MBA.com as soon as they are available to the public. So I would encourage you to keep checking that. My thoughts on that, and I guess we'll talk about this when it comes to what to do if you're testing in the spring in just a moment. All right. Is I would not rush to be the first person to do the GMAT in-home experience. Now, I will say several of us Manhattan Prep instructors are going to do it as soon as it's available. So we can get a sense of what it's like, and we can inform students what to expect with respect to the in-home GMAT experience. So you could take a look at our blog, manhattanprep.com/GMAT/blog, and look for some updates on that in mid to late April. But what I would say is that if you're testing in the summer or the fall, either the test centers will be open again, or there will have been time for any kinks associated with the in-home GMAT experience to be worked out. So you'll have a better sense of what that experience is going to be like and whether that's an option for you down the road. Now, what about those of you who are planning to test in the spring? You are maybe going to be taking a test in mid-April or late April. For all of you, I'd say it's time to make an honest assessment. Let's talk through what should go into that. I really want you to think, which one of the following best describes your current GMAT status? And I'd put you either into category 1, which is I think I might need some more time to get to my target score, or category 2, I really was ready to go, or almost ready to go for this. So what you're going to do will depend on which category you find yourself in. Let's talk through category 1 first, right? So those of you who are thinking, hey, I need a little bit more time. The first thing I'd say is great. You have it now. You have a reason to push back your test a little bit and get your skill set to where it really needs to be to get the kind of score that you want to get. So what I want you thinking is probably May or June at the earliest for taking the test. I want you to ask yourself, why do I need more time? What is it that's really holding me back? Let's make sure, again, we're being highly intentional with our studies. We're identifying what it is that's preventing us from being where we want to be already. And let's reset our studies as needed. So what I would recommend if you're in this situation is that you go ahead and plan for multiple, what I'll call lift my score cycles. All right, so what's a lift my score cycle? This is what I have my tutoring students do, what I have my class students do post-course, right? So after they've kind of covered the fundamental content. So what one of these cycles looks like is 2 to 4 weeks each. You kick this off with a practice test. And there's lots of different places you can get practice tests. Make sure that you are doing an adaptive practice test. Manhattan Prep has one free practice test and some additional ones you can purchase. They're the 2 official ones from MBA.com. And then obviously there are a lot of them with GMAT Club as well. So take a practice test, analyze it very carefully. And what you're trying to do is take various skills, various content areas, and put them into buckets. I want you to think of bucket 1 as really your strengths. This is the stuff you feel good about, the stuff you're confident in. You tend to get these problems right. You tend to get them right in a reasonable amount of time. You don't need to do extra work with bucket 1 material. Where you need to do extra work is in bucket 2. These are your weaknesses that might be what I would describe as near weaknesses. So they're weaknesses where you see a path to turn them into strengths in the order of a couple weeks. Right? These are really your priorities. These could be areas where maybe there are some basic content things you need to go brush up on. Or maybe, as we discussed earlier, these are areas where you just have tendencies to make careless mistakes, right? So this is where you're spending most of your focus time. There should also be, by the way, be a bucket that you just ignore for now, right? If you're at, say, a Quant 42 and you're looking to push to a Quant 46, Combinatorics and probability should be in bucket 3 for you. There's going to be other more commonly tested stuff that's going to do a lot more to move your score from a 42 to a 46. Right? So you need to have some things in bucket 3 that you're saying, I'm going to ignore for now. Maybe later on down the road, when I'm closer to my target score, then that little thing is the missing piece. But for now, I'm going to focus my efforts on bucket 2. Right? So that's what you do if you need more time. Reset your studies, plan for multiples of these lift my score cycles, and then obviously at the end of each cycle, you do another practice test to reassess and see where things stand. Now, what about category 2? I was almost ready to go. I was hoping to take the test next week and it got canceled. One, I feel for you. I'm sorry that happened. That is tough. Right? It really is. When you're geared up, you're ready to go. This happened to a couple students of mine. And this is what got my thinking on all of this kickstarted, was actually just giving advice to those specific students. So I'd say a couple things here. You're probably still going to be testing in May or June at the earliest. As I said earlier, the GMAC has announced there's going to be the in-home experience in mid-April. Again, my advice for the most part would be that you wait until May if you're going to do that, right? Wait until some other people have done it so you can learn more about the experience. You know better what to expect going into it. I would not, in general, jump to taking the test right in mid-April. Maybe the one exception would be if you have taken multiple real GMATs before, you're very close to your target score, and you really just need to get this done. Right, you're busy with work stuff in May, and you just got to get it done. That might be the one time I would encourage you to sign up for the early iteration of the in-home test. Okay, but it's going to be very important to make sure you avoid GMAT burnout. And I'll tell you, GMAT burnout is a real thing, and it is like spraining your ankle. You got a bad ankle sprain. There is only one way that's really going to get better, and that's if you don't walk on it for a couple weeks. So make sure you do not burn yourself out, especially if you're already ready to go. If you're ready to go, it means you don't have a lot of skills you need to add to your skill set. And so studying full on, as you've been maybe for months to this point, is a recipe for burnout. So I want you to take planned breaks as you need. Everybody should have an off day or 2 off days a week. Your brain will thank you on the other days. You'll learn more effectively on the other 6 on days. If you have the 1 day a week, you don't touch the GMAT. And for those of you in this position, you might even take some longer breaks as needed. You might take 4 days off. You might take a week off. I don't want you to worry about getting rusty taking 4 days off or taking a week off, right? Your skills are not going to deteriorate over that short of a time period. And honestly, anything that does get rusty after a week is probably something you needed to revisit anyway. So I want you to not feel guilty about doing these kind of things as you go, right? Make a plan, set a time in your calendar 4 days down the road or 7 days down the road and say, okay, that's when I'm going to get back to it. That's when I'm going to have my next study session. But don't feel guilty about taking some planned time off as needed. I would also say during the weeks that you are studying, you might go into what you could call maintenance mode. Right? So this is when you're not going full on studying. You're not studying 12 or 15 hours in a week as perhaps you have been in the past, but you're just trying to maintain your skills for 3 to 4 hours per week. I think the sort of primary activity in maintenance mode really should be random timed sets of official guide problems and deep review and error logging of those random time sets. So you're continuing to work on that habit formation stuff we talked about before. You're continuing to do your error logging and your deep review to make sure that you're really learning from every time set that you do. That should be kind of the primary driver of your studies in maintenance mode. But you might also do some drill sets here and there to work on your foundations. You might use this time to revisit some of your error log problems, etc. Okay, but if you're in category 2, this is what your studies should be kind of a combination of at this point. Some planned breaks as needed, and then maintenance mode otherwise. So in closing, I want us all just to remember, these are kind of unprecedented times. The GMAC, your business school of choice, everyone is figuring this out one day at a time. And that is ultimately the best that you can do. If you needed more time anyway, capitalize on that opportunity. Right? Use it as a chance to rethink and reset your GMAT studies to make that study time all the more effective. Do not burn yourself out. And finally, let's not forget to breathe. So I see we got a little more than 20 minutes left right here. I would love to take the time to just answer some questions. So I'm going to actually turn off my share screen so I can take a look and easily see some of the different questions. I saw a lot of different good questions coming in, but I believe Abhijit is going to give me some specific ones to address right here. So, all right, I see. What would be a good time now to take the GMAT? So again, Shubhan, I think that very much depends on where you are in your studies right now. If you're just getting started with your studies or you're kind of midway through your studies, I think you would want to be looking at the summer, right? Or perhaps even the fall if you're just getting started, right? And so in that case, as I said before, you probably don't need to radically change your timeline, your plan. Either the test centers should be open by that point or all of the kinks of the in-home GMAT experience should be worked out by then. So I wouldn't change things dramatically there. If, on the other hand, if you were later into your studies, you're ready to take it right now, perhaps even you were planning to take it in April, I would, again, take a look at planning to do it in May. And either, let's all hope, of course, that the test centers are just open by then. But if not, again, the GMAT in-home experience should be up and running. Again, that'll be the case in mid-April, but I would wait until May just to see if there are any kinks to work out. All right. Do you think that the All the Verbal book by Manhattan is sufficient to strike the verbal part? Well, I'm a little biased, obviously. But I think that obviously our books are very good. The All the Verbal part covers sentence correction, critical reasoning, and reading comprehension. So all components of the verbal section. Now, if I were preparing, and I say this to students who come to a trial class of mine and they say, I'm not sure that the class is right for me, I want to try some self-study, is I tell them, in terms of what's really necessary, I do think you need some kind of content book, right, to walk you through at a level that's a little different from the official guide, how to think about and how to solve these problems. But I also believe the official guide really is necessary. It's so important to study with source material for this test. And there's just no getting away from actual retired GMAT problems. So I wouldn't quite say our book alone is sufficient. I think our book plus the official guide together would be sufficient. The problem with just having the official guide, though, is, of course, you've got to remember the GMAC is in the business of assessing you. They're in the business of testing you. They're not in the business of helping you prepare for the test they're making you take. And so that's why I think the official guide plus some kind of content material written by someone who is in the business of helping you prepare, that's going to be the best combination to get ready. Hype G. Yeah, the GMAT is going online. So again, this was just announced a couple days ago. We have very few details right now. The place to look for additional details as they come out is just the mba.com homepage. You'll see a link there for all of their coronavirus-related updates. And so they did announce, and they're saying by mid-April, there should be some in-home GMAT experience available. Now, they have not really said anything beyond that, right? So we're still in a holding pattern to see what the details are. Again, we're going to make sure we have a lot of Manhattan Prep instructors go do that in-home experience as soon as it's available, so we can get a better sense of how to advise students on that front. And you can take a look at our blog for perhaps some updates there. But that's about all that's known right at the moment. So again, my advice would not be to rush to be the first person to do that, all right? Unless you, for some reason, really need to. I would wait a couple weeks so you can hear some reports on GMAT Club. I'm sure some people will post some reports. On our blog, people will post some reports. I would get a sense of what I'm getting into before I do that in-home experience. Let's see, Sahil, what do you suggest for test series? I'm sorry, Sahil, could you clarify? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that question. All right, we'll see if a follow-up to that comes up. Manhattan book for word problems. Good enough for probability sets and combinations. Let me tell you something about probability and combinatorics. So for starters, combinatorics is a big fancy word for the study of counting. That's literally all it means, which I always found very humorous back in, I was in graduate school for mathematics. And of course, some of my friends were getting their PhDs in combinatorics. They were technically getting their PhDs in counting. Now, they were doing stuff that I don't understand. It gets very complex very quickly. But I took the GMAT. I've taken it 6 or 7 times now. I took it most recently just last month, actually. And I'll tell you, on my test, I saw 1 combinatorics question. I saw 0 probability questions. For whatever reason, those 2 areas, I think because there are a lot of fancy-looking formulas related to those, they strike more fear and stress into the hearts of GMAT test takers worldwide than just about any other topic. And they really don't matter that much. I got to tell you, unless you're in the position where you already have, say, a quant 47, and you're trying to push higher to 48, 49, 50, maybe if you're in that position, you already know you can get 47 reliably, and you're trying to push higher, maybe in that position, yeah, learn some of the basic combinatorics formulas, like the choose formula, and some basic probability principles. And yes, all that's covered in our books. But if you're not in that position already, I mean, a half hour spent studying just about anything else is going to do more for your score than a half hour spent studying probability and combinatorics. Right? So it's like, unless you're perfect at ratios and you're perfect at exponents and you're perfect at statistics, other more frequently tested stuff, I would spend the time on those areas. And I would put probability and combinatorics into that 3rd bucket that we talked about earlier. All right, how many hours a day do you recommend studying for the GMAT in category 1? All right, so for everybody else, in case you've forgotten, category 1 was the I think I need more time category, right? So for folks in that position, you're still in pretty much full study mode. Now, again, some of the other things I said, if you have more pressing concerns right now related to everything that's going on in the world, please attend to those. Those are higher priority than the GMAT. But if you're in a full-on study mode, I'll tell you what I usually tell my class students. Try to get into some kind of routine, right, where you have a consistent, say, Monday through Thursday routine. And maybe you're studying an hour each day, Monday through Thursday. Maybe you're studying 2 hours each day, Monday through Thursday. If you are studying more than an hour, I would highly recommend breaking your study time up into shorter, more focused study blocks. I really actually don't encourage studying more than an hour at a time without at least a short break, right? And this is the way I run my classes too. So our classes are 3 hours. I give students 2 breaks. So we work hard for an hour, we take a short break, work hard for an hour, take a short break, work hard for an hour. There's a lot of learning science that shows that that type of study is radically more effective. It's also basically the way the test works, right? The quant section is 62 minutes, the verbal is 65, and essay and integrated reasoning is another hour. So you're basically working in these 3 little 1-hour blocks. So I think it also trains your brain to think that way, right? And to be on for an hour, knowing you're going to get a little break. Most people are going to have a little more time to study, Carolina, on the weekends, and I totally understand. I would continue studying in those little 1-hour blocks. I've just maybe tried to do 3 of them. And I would still have a GMAT off day once a week. So, if you add all of that up, like that would work out to somewhere between 12 and 15 hours a week. Honestly, I really wouldn't advise studying a whole lot more than that. And I say this to even people who sometimes take my class and they're, in between jobs and they're thinking, oh, I can take a few weeks and just make the GMAT my full-time job, right? The thing about studying more than, say, 3 hours in a day, there's just only so much the human mind can absorb in a single day. You need that time where literally you're sleeping and the stuff you're learning is going to your longer-term memory. That's necessary for the learning process. And I got to say, if I tried to study something for 4 hours in a day, I'm probably not learning anything in the 4th hour. And if I am, it's just replacing what I learned in the 1st hour. And so I would usually set a cap of about 3 hours in a given day. All right. But Carolina, let me also encourage you to listen to your own mind. Don't think of it as logging hours, right? Think of it as, what am I really getting out of this extra hour study? Am I really mastering something? And at the end of every hour you study, if you can look back and say, okay, I'm better at this skill and that skill after that hour, then that was a good hour. So aim for as many of those as you can get to. All right, I got a question about filling out the error log. Yeah, let me reshare my screen. I'll go back to that slide. Love this question. So let me, okay, here we go. All right, so there's my kind of sample error log. I think at a minimum, it should have these 5 components. Some people do a little bit more, and that's totally fine. But I think these are really the core features of it. And in terms of, just functionally how you do you do it by hand in a notebook? Do you do it in Excel or Google Sheets? Personal preference, like whatever works best for you. Some people like to get fancy with it, have it on a computer. That's great. Some people really think that it helps the takeaways stick with them better when they're writing it out physically by hand. That's great as well. But these are the 5 components that I think you got to, at a minimum, have these 5 here. The problem, so you can look it up later to redo it. Content categorization, a clear diagnosis of your mistake, an actionable takeaway, and a plan to revisit, a plan to redo that problem. All right, are Manhattan tests harder than the real GMAT? Weird, Adam, you're the first person who's ever asked that question of me. No, I'm kidding. I get that question a lot. What I'll say is, Adam, we're constantly calibrating our practice tests based on real student experience and whatnot. And so we try to make it absolutely as accurate as possible. Now, no practice test is going to be perfect. And this even includes the official practice tests that you get on MBA.com. I think those have some actually pretty serious flaws in some respects. But yeah, our practice tests are not perfect. I would say probably the biggest fault of our practice tests, it's not that the quant section as a whole is harder, right? It is adaptive, just like the real test. So how difficult it is actually depends on how you're doing, of course, right? That's the biggest effect. But I will say there probably are a couple problems in our practice test bank that are a little bit harder than anything you'd see on the real GMAT in a specific way. They might require some slightly more extensive computations than a GMAT problem. So in real GMAT problems, even at the highest levels, it's often the case that there's kind of a backdoor solution where you don't have to do a ton of crazy computations. And so, it's often the problems from a practice test that kind of bother us the most that make the biggest imprint in our minds. And so you might have had an experience with our practice test where you saw a couple that were maybe a little bit too hard, even for the real GMAT, and that can sometimes kind of stick with us. But again, we're constantly calibrating things so that they can be as accurate a predictor as possible. Ooh, great question, Karan. So different things work for different people, And for those of you, just make sure everybody's on the same page here, you've got 3 options for the order of the test. You could do the quant section first, followed by verbal, and then essay and IR. Or you could do the verbal first, followed by quant, and then finish with essay and integrated reasoning. Or you could do GMAT Classic, which is the order you used to have to do it in, which is essay and integrated reasoning first, then quant, and then verbal. For the vast majority of people, I'd say don't do the essay IR first option, right? So there may be some exceptions, but you've got to remember that essay and IR do not factor into your 2 to 800 score. It's just quant and verbal, the quant and verbal subscores that determine that. And you can search GMAT scoring chart to find how those 2 things piece together. But because essay and IR don't ultimately matter that much. I mean, you don't want to get a bad score on those sections, but they're not the most important. You usually want to save that for the end, right? When you're going to be most tired, most fatigued. So as for whether you do quant first or verbal first, different things work for different people. I'd say one thing just to keep in mind is that you are going to be more fatigued for your second section. Just fact, right? You're going to have to work hard for an hour on whichever section you do first. So you are going to be experiencing some level of fatigue for that second section. So a lot of deciding the right order comes down to you thinking through on which section will I handle the fatigue better? And that's where the answer is different for different people. I strongly encourage you to be experimental with it. You should have tried a practice test both ways to see which one you like. I do find students are often surprised by the order they end up preferring. And the final thing I'll say on this is just if you really are legitimately on the fence, you can't decide, do I want to do quant first or verbal first? I'm going to push you to the verbal first side. That is actually what I do. And it's just, I find that with verbal, everything about verbal is in some sense every day. I mean, you read every day, you engage with arguments every day. You think about sentence correction, grammar, and meaning every time you speak or write, just at a subconscious level. But because all of it has this kind of everyday surface to it, it's tough sometimes to remind ourselves that there really is a process for verbal. There's a system to doing verbal. It takes a lot of willpower to stick to that system and not just wing it when it comes to verbal. I find that on quant, we all know at a gut level that quant requires a process. You wouldn't even think to do math any other way. And so sometimes I think it can be nice to do verbal first when your energy levels are the highest and you get the highest reserve of willpower, and then you're still going to be okay quant second. But again, different things for different people, so you have to be experimental with it. All right. I see, Sahil. That makes more sense. You're asking about practice test, which practice test to buy. Well, again, I'm pretty biased. I don't want to pretend otherwise, but I think our practice tests are very, very good. And, for me, it's not just the practice tests themselves, which put a lot of effort into making sure we have very good questions and making sure we have an algorithm, an adaptive algorithm that works as closely to the real test as possible. But the really great thing about our practice test is all the diagnostic tools. So our practice tests, I believe, have some of the most detailed and thorough diagnostic tools for really assessing your performance. And I want you to remember that's the goal with any practice test you do out there. The purpose is not to see the practice test say some number. I mean, I'll tell you this, when you get to the test center, they're not going to ask you how you did on your practice test. and I've seen everything under the sun. I've seen people struggle to get over 650 on a practice test and then go rock a 720 on the real test. I've seen people consistently hit 720 on a practice test and then struggle and get a 650 on the real test, right? So, so much of this comes down to how you perform, how you execute the day of. So the real value in practice tests is not even necessarily their accuracy in terms of score prediction. It's what kind of tools do the practice tests come with to help you break down your performance and find those opportunities for improving. All right. Most frequently tested quant questions. Yeah, so we break things out into 5 big content areas: fractions, decimals, percents, and ratios. All right, so each of those are very heavily tested. You got algebra as well. Within algebra, the most important things are linear equations, exponential equations, inequalities are very important in algebra. Then we have a word problems category. The most important things in word problems would be translation type problems and statistics. Statistics are huge on this test. And then number properties. Within number properties, you got divisibility and primes, you've got evens and odds, positives and negatives. And then you've got geometry as the fifth major content area. You've got various shapes there. Now, actually, of those 5 that I just mentioned, geometry is the least frequently tested. You're just going to see 3 or 4, possibly 5 geometry problems, but 3 or 4 is more the norm. So we talked about the big, important content areas to really have mastered. Again, it's fractions, decimals, percents, and ratios. Those few algebra topics, linear equations, exponential equations, quadratics, inequalities. Some word problem types like rates and translations and statistics, and number properties where you find divisibility and evens, odds, and positives and negatives. All right, last question coming up here. Oh, the $1 million question, the one everybody wants to know. So 660 to 730. Well, let me address the timeline aspect of that first. So I will tell you, in my experience, that is the most difficult thing to predict, is how long it's going to take you to get that kind of improvement. I would say I fully believe this is a highly beatable test. I believe basically everybody can get to basically whatever score they want, given enough time and enough of the right kind of study. In terms of timeline, though, I've seen everything under the sun. I mean, I've seen somebody go from a 550 to a 720 in 10 days. Now, that was a very special circumstance. This was a student I worked with who she already had a really great foundation, right? She was a math major. She read a lot, so she had a good foundation on the verbal side as well. She was just messing up the timing. And I mean, we had a tutoring session where I told her some timing strategies and then her score shot up, right? But I've seen people have to work for months to get the kind of improvement you're asking about, GMAT Assassin, to go from 660 to 730. That's often a really hard boundary to push through. So I think a lot of it comes down to what's holding you back at this point. And that's the big thing to take a look at. Let me also encourage you to, if you're not already, you might be doing this already, but think in terms of subscores. So both the quant and verbal sections get a subscore that's on an up to 51 point scale. And it's those subscores that combine to give you your overall score. And again, you can Google to find some charts that show you this. A couple good benchmarks, though. You're going to need your quant plus verbal subscore to add up to about 86 total points to get to 700. And you're going to need it to add up to about 90 total points to get to 730. Right. So the other thing I'd really emphasize with getting to 730 is make sure you don't neglect verbal. You need to get a really, really good verbal subscore to get that kind of overall score. And that's just because you need the two of them to add up to 90, and they only go up to 51 each. So even if you get a perfect quant 51, you would still need a 39 on the verbal side to get to that target. All right. Well, I see we're at the end of our hour. Thanks again so much, everybody. I was really happy to get to talk to you about these opportunities to reset your studies and to answer some of your questions here at the end. So I hope you all stay safe, stay healthy. Don't forget to breathe. Try some mindfulness meditation, and take care, everybody.